We're going to speak with Mr. Deepak Khandelwal. Deepak was, in fact, only 17 when he lost his sisters, Chandra and Manju, in this tragedy. He's speaking to us from Toronto. Deepak, thank you for speaking with us. What do you remember of that day? Let's start with that.
Well, back in 1985, as you said, I was 17. My sisters and I were supposed to go to my uncle's wedding in India. So that was the trip. I was supposed to go with them, but due to a last-minute scholarship I received to go to the University of Calgary, I canceled my ticket just beforehand. So that day was me and my father taking my sisters to the airport. We were living in Western Canada at the time, a place called Saskatoon. We took them to the airport, we dropped them off, and thinking everything was all fine. I then boarded a bus, an overnight bus to go to the University of Calgary. And then unfortunately, when I arrived in Calgary, I was informed that, well, the way they positioned it was my father was not feeling well, so I needed to return home. So I jumped on a plane to come back to Saskatoon, and when I landed in Saskatoon, obviously I heard what the reality was that the plane was missing and had disappeared off the coast of Ireland. So a pretty shocking day, and probably the most difficult part of it is we were all in different locations. I was on a bus on the way to Calgary. My father was in Saskatoon. My mother had already arrived in India for the wedding. So we were all separated.
Right. Deepak, what ensued thereafter? Obviously, apart from the great bereavement that you and your family suffered, there must have also prevailed a sense of exacting justice at that point in time.
Well, I mean, at that time I was 17 and we were a little bit isolated being in Western Canada, and there was no internet back then, so communications was quite limited. So you didn't really know what was going on, but you could tell early on that things were not right. I actually went to Ireland with my father to go identify the bodies, and there was no Canadian officials there to support us. There was no victim counseling. There was no emotional support, nothing at all. And as there was over 280 Canadians that were on this flight. The Canadian government really didn't take this seriously. Just to give you an example of how unseriously they took this, you have the largest mass murder in Canadian history, the worst act of aviation terrorism other than 9/11. And it took 20 years for a Canadian Prime Minister to even meet with the families. So, I mean, this whole process has been very poorly handled from day one. I would say things have gotten a little bit better in family communications recently, but the early years were very, very poor, and it seemed like nobody up here really cared about what had happened.
Deepak, you also feel that initially there was intelligence failure to figure out whether something like this could happen in plain sight, and there were a lot of incidents, right before this crash, which were completely and blatantly ignored, by the authorities at the security services in Canada. And post the crash, picking up the clues, trying to be serious about people who knew something or the other about this crash or the perpetrators, there was not much gravitas to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, this was a completely preventable tragedy in my opinion. There were significant failures on the investigation side ahead of time as the intelligence services. And as you said, there were direct warnings that there was going to be a bomb placed on an Air India flight. There was only one flight a week at that time, so it's not hard to figure out which flight that might be. So, as Dr. Gupta mentioned as well, there were surveillance failures of when they were following people and stopped following people. They didn't take pictures. They knew there was an explosion that was testing bomb material. So significant failures prior to the bombing. There were procedural failings on the day of the bombing. The investigation itself had significant failures post-bombing, just in whether it's the wiretaps that were erased, which makes absolutely no sense at all. In the public inquiry, I talked about that, as well as Justice Major mentioned that it's just inconceivable that people would erase wiretaps in such a critical case. And then as went into the legal case, there was, lots of evidence was not accepted. Lots of witnesses were either no longer around, and so were unable to speak, or the judge deemed them to be unacceptable witnesses. So there was just mistakes all around in this entire process, from pre-bombing, day of bombing, post-bombing, the legal case, and it's just been very, very disappointing for the families.
Deepak, last question before we let you go. Do you think that the families will ever see the light of justice prevail as long as Canada continues, with its policy of, putting freedom of speech before justice?
Yeah, I think it's very unfortunate. We have a situation where known extremists and terrorists are celebrated at events. Pictures are shown. Canadian politicians go to those events, or need or want to get the political votes, and it's very disheartening to see that. It's very hurtful when terrorists are glorified and celebrated in this country. And I think we need to be very, very careful in this country that something like what happened to us, where 329 innocent people were murdered by terrorists, something like that does not happen again, because no one should have to go through this again. It's a real shame.
Deepak, appreciate you joining us. Thank you so much for speaking with NewsX.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.